Parents, what would you do if your child who screwed you over begged you for a second chance? 18 months ago, my daughter started dating Kaysen. She was 21, old enough to make her own choices, but something felt wrong from day one. Within 3 weeks of meeting him, Lottie had emptied her entire savings account to loan him money. When I asked her about it, she got defensive. He needs it for rent, Dad. I'm helping him out. 2 months into their relationship, I woke up at 2 a.m. to noise coming from my daughter's bedroom. I walked down the hallway and found them, Lottie and Kaysen, both drunk, going through my dead wife's jewelry box. What the hell are you doing? I turned on the light and they both jumped. Lottie stumbled. Dad, relax. We just need to borrow some of this. Kaysen's landlord is kicking him out. We need rent money. Borrow? You're stealing your dead mother's jewelry. Kaysen stepped forward, holding my wife's ring. Look, man, she's dead. She doesn't need this stuff anymore. I slapped him because of that. Hard enough to make him fall. I grabbed the jewelry box and pulled it away. Get out. Both of you. Lottie's face went red. I hate you. Mom would have understood. I never want to see you again. She stormed out. Kaysen punched a hole in my hallway wall on his way out. The next morning, I woke up to a text from Lottie. She called me selfish, said I ruined everything, said she wished I had died instead of Mom. I tried to call her, but she'd blocked my number. I cried reading it, hoping she'd come to her senses before it was too late. 4 months went by without a word. Then one night, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I didn't answer it, but then a text came through. Dad, I'm so sorry for everything. Please come help me. Kaysen's beating me, please hurry. She sent her address. My heart stopped. She may have wronged me, but she's my daughter. I grabbed my keys and ran to my car. I got to the apartment building in 15 minutes. I ran up the stairs, didn't even wait for the elevator. I found the apartment and started banging on the door. Lottie! Lottie! Open up! The door actually opened. Kaysen stood there looking furious. I pushed past him immediately, ready to grab Lottie and get her out of there. Then I saw her. She was standing in the living room, completely fine. No bruises, no tears, nothing. She looked at me with dead eyes. Before I could say anything, I felt cold metal press against the back of my neck. Kaysen had moved behind me. He had a knife against my skin. Wallet. Now. My stomach dropped. I realized what this was. My own daughter had set me up. Lottie. I looked at her, my voice breaking. She didn't say anything, just stared at me with no emotion on her face at all. Kaysen pressed the knife harder, and I felt blood start to trickle down my neck. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my wallet. I gave him everything. All my cash, my credit cards. The whole time I kept looking at Lottie, waiting for her to say she was sorry, to do anything. She just watched. No remorse. Nothing. Get out, Kaysen said, shoving me toward the door. I drove home and immediately called the police. Gave them the address, told them everything. By the time cops got there, the apartment was empty. Lottie and Kaysen were gone. The police told me both of them were now on a wanted list, but they weren't actively searching. They had bigger cases. 14 months passed, and then morning, someone knocked on my door. I opened it to see Lottie on my porch, crying, bruised, broken, barefoot in a tank top and pants. She had a black eye and marks on her arms. Please help me, Dad. Kaysen's trying to kill me. I stayed in the doorway. Every instinct told me not to fall for it again. How do I know this isn't another setup? Before she could answer, I saw Kaysen's truck pull up to my curb. He got out and started walking toward my house fast. Lottie panicked. Please, Dad, please let me in. I made the split-second decision to pull her inside and lock the door. She dropped to her knees and started sobbing. I'm so sorry. He's going to kill me. Kaysen started banging on my door. Let her out. You remember what she did last time? You don't want to protect her. I looked into Lottie's eyes. I saw real terror. Still holding her, I walked to my living room and opened my gun safe, took out my pistol, walked back to the door, still holding Lottie with my other arm. I looked at her. I love you, but I don't trust you, so I'm going to open this door and shoot his kneecaps. Then I'll get the truth from both of you. I opened the door. Kaysen charged in with his knife raised. I fired once. The bullet hit his kneecap instantly. Kaysen collapsed on my floor, screaming, clutching his shattered knee. The knife skittered across the room. Lottie stared at me, then at Kaysen bleeding on my entryway. I kept the gun pointed down at him, my other arm still around my daughter. Now, I said, someone's going to tell me the truth. Kaysen kept screaming on my floor, and the blood was spreading across the tile in a pool that looked too big. I grabbed my phone from my pocket with my left hand while keeping the gun pointed at him with my right. My fingers were shaking so bad I almost dropped it. Lottie pressed harder against my side, and I could feel her whole body trembling like she was freezing. I dialed 911, and the operator answered after 2 rings. I told her there were shots fired at my address, and I needed police and ambulance right away. She asked if anyone was hurt, and I looked down at Kaysen writhing on the floor, clutching his knee. I said yes. 1 person shot in the leg, still conscious, bleeding a lot. The operator told me to stay on the line and asked if the shooter was still there. I said I was the shooter, and it was self-defense. She went quiet for a second, then told me to put down any weapons and wait for officers to arrive. I said okay, but I didn't put the gun down yet because Kaysen was still moving, and I didn't trust him. Lottie was sobbing against my shoulder, and the sound was making it hard to think straight. The operator asked if there were any other people in the house, and I told her just me, my daughter, and the intruder who attacked us. She said units were 4 minutes out and to stay calm. I forced myself to look at Lottie's face in the harsh light from the entryway fixture. Her left eye was swollen almost shut, and the skin around it was dark purple and black. Fresh, maybe from yesterday or this morning. There were bruises on both her upper arms that looked like finger marks, like someone had grabbed her really hard and squeezed. I counted 5 distinct marks on her right arm. The bruises looked real, not makeup, but I'd been fooled before and my stomach twisted thinking about the robbery setup. What if this was just part 2? What if she and Kaysen planned this whole thing? But the marks looked deep, the kind that come from real violence. Her lower lip was split on one side, and there was dried blood in the corner of her mouth. I wanted to believe her so badly it hurt. Kaysen started yelling between his screams of pain. He called Lottie a lying bitch and said she stole from him. He yelled that I was going to prison for shooting him and he'd make sure of it. I told him to shut up and stay down, trying to sound steady even though my hands were still shaking. Through the window, I saw Victor's porch light come on across the street. He was probably calling the cops too after hearing the gunshot. Lottie flinched every time Kaysen yelled, pressing herself smaller against me like she was trying to disappear. She wasn't faking that fear. I'd seen her scared before, but never like this. Never with her whole body shaking and her breath coming in short gasps, like she couldn't get enough air. Kaysen kept screaming threats, and Lottie whimpered and pushed her face into my shoulder. Whatever else was true, she was genuinely terrified of him in a way that made something click in my head. The sirens started wailing in the distance and got louder fast. Within 4 minutes, like the operator said, my street was full of flashing red and blue lights. Car doors slammed and I heard boots on my front steps. The door I'd left open after Kaysen charged through it suddenly filled with uniformed officers, at least 4 of them, all with guns drawn and pointed at me. They yelled for me to put my weapon down slowly. I did it immediately, bending down carefully and setting the pistol on the floor next to the wall. I raised both hands and told them I was the homeowner, and I shot the intruder in self-defense. One officer kicked my gun away while another moved toward Kaysen. 2 paramedics rushed past me carrying bags and equipment and dropped down next to Kaysen, who was still conscious and yelling. An officer grabbed my arm and pulled me away from Lottie. Another officer took her other direction toward the living room, and she looked back at me with panic in her eyes. They sat me down at my kitchen table, while another cop stood near me with his hand on his belt. Through the doorway, I could see the other officer talking to Lottie in the living room. She was crying and pointing at her bruises and moving her hands around frantically. The officer sitting across from me at my kitchen table pulled out a notebook and started asking questions. He looked young, maybe late 20s, with short brown hair and a name tag that said Isaac. He asked me to explain what happened, and I told him everything. Kaysen charged into my house with a knife raised, and I fired once to stop him. Isaac wrote it all down, his pen moving across the page in quick strokes. I explained the history, because I knew it mattered. 14 months ago, Lottie and Kaysen set me up for a robbery. They lured me to their apartment, and Kaysen held a knife to my neck and took my wallet. I filed a police report, and they both went on a wanted list. This morning, Lottie showed up at my door claiming Kaysen was trying to kill her. Then Kaysen arrived and charged at my house. Isaac kept writing, and then he asked a question that made my stomach drop. He asked if I said anything to my daughter before opening the door. I hesitated, and then told him the truth. I said I told Lottie I was going to open the door and shoot Kaysen's kneecaps, then get the truth from both of them. Isaac stopped writing and looked up at me. He asked me to repeat that, and I did. He made a note, and I realized right then that I'd just made this look like I planned it, instead of defending myself. The word premeditated floated through my head, and I felt sick. Through the doorway, I watched the paramedics working on Kaysen. They had him on a stretcher now and were wrapping his knee in bandages. He was still conscious and yelling about pressing charges and lawsuits. They wheeled him out through my front door, and I watched them load him into the ambulance. The flashing lights made everything look unreal, like I was watching it happen to someone else. I felt nothing but cold certainty that my life just got way more complicated than I could handle. About 30 minutes later, a stocky man in his 40s walked into my kitchen. He had tired eyes and thinning hair and wore a rumpled button-down shirt with no tie. He introduced himself as Detective Tyler Grimes and said he was the lead investigator. He told Officer Isaac to give him the notes, and Isaac handed over his notebook and left. Tyler read through everything while I sat there trying not to panic. Then he looked up and told me we needed to separate me and my daughter completely for now. He walked to the living room, and I heard him talking to Lottie. Then he brought her out through the front door. Through the window, I watched him put her in the back of a police car. She wasn't under arrest, he said when he came back, but he needed to question us separately to get accurate statements. We sat back down at my kitchen table, and Tyler asked me to go through the whole thing again from the beginning. I told him everything, including my statement about shooting kneecaps. His face didn't change, but I saw him make a note, and I knew that wasn't good for me. He asked about the previous robbery, and I got up and found the police report from 14 months ago in my desk drawer. I showed it to him and explained how Lottie texted me claiming Kaysen was beating her, how I rushed to their apartment, how it was a setup, and Kaysen robbed me at knife point. Tyler read the report carefully and asked why I let Lottie in this morning if I didn't trust her. I struggled to explain it. She's my daughter. She was on my porch begging for help with bruises all over her face. How do you leave your kid outside when they're saying someone's trying to kill them? Tyler nodded slowly and said he'd seen a lot of domestic violence cases where family members get caught in the middle. But then he said my statement about planning to shoot kneecaps made this complicated because it suggested I had time to think and plan instead of just reacting to an immediate threat. That made the self-defense claim harder to prove. Tyler told me I needed to come to the station for formal questioning. He said I wasn't under arrest, but I wasn't free to leave either. I rode in the back of a police car to the station, and they put me in a small interview room with gray walls and a metal table. I sat there for 2 hours while they processed the scene. Tyler came in and out a few times, but mostly I just waited and tried not to think about how badly I'd screwed up by telling Lottie my plan. The words kept echoing in my head. I'm going to open this door and shoot his kneecaps. Why did I say that? Why didn't I just call the cops and keep the door locked? But I knew why. Because Kaysen was out there threatening my daughter and I wanted to end it. I wanted to stop him from ever hurting her again, but now it looked like I set him up instead of defending myself. Finally, Tyler came back and sat down across from me. He had a folder full of papers and photos. He told me they'd interviewed my neighbor Victor, who saw Kaysen's truck pull up and watched him charge toward my house in an aggressive manner. That supported my version of events. But my own words about planning to shoot his kneecaps were still a major problem. Tyler opened the folder and showed me photos of Lottie's injuries taken at the hospital. Her black eye, the finger-shaped bruises on her arms, marks on her ribs and back. He said the hospital confirmed she had injuries consistent with ongoing abuse. Old bruises at different stages of healing, yellow and green mixed with fresh purple ones. 2 cracked ribs that were weeks old. Her story matched mine, Tyler said. Kaysen had been beating her for months, and she finally escaped this morning and ran to the only place she felt safe. But then Tyler showed me something else. Text messages from Kaysen's phone. He said Kaysen was claiming Lottie stole money from him, and I ambushed him when he came to get it back. Kaysen said this whole thing was a setup to justify shooting him. Tyler watched my face carefully and asked which story I thought was true. I looked at the photos of Lottie's bruises and the cracked ribs and told him I thought my daughter was finally telling the truth. But I could hear the doubt in my own voice, and I knew Tyler heard it too. Tyler leaned back in his chair and asked if I'd let them search my house for any signs I planned this whole thing out ahead of time. I said yes right away because I had nothing to hide except my own stupid words about shooting kneecaps. He nodded and made another note before standing up and telling me to wait in the lobby while they finished processing everything. I walked out to the station lobby and sat in a hard plastic chair next to a vending machine that hummed too loud. Crime scene techs were still at my house photographing the blood on my entryway floor and bagging the knife Kaysen had dropped. I sat there for what felt like hours watching people come and go through the station doors. Cops bringing in suspects, families waiting for news, a woman crying into her phone in the corner. The whole time my brain kept circling back to one thought. What if Lottie was telling the truth this time? What if she'd been trapped with Kaysen for 14 months getting beaten while I ignored her calls because I was too angry to answer? The guilt hit me so hard I had to put my head between my knees to keep from throwing up right there in the lobby. I'd refused to help my own daughter because she'd betrayed me once. But what if that one betrayal had led to months of suffering I could have stopped? I sat up and stared at the clock on the wall. It was past midnight now. Tyler came out around 3 a.m. and told me I could go home, but I needed to stay in town and be ready for more questions. He said Lottie was released too, since she was a witness and possible victim, not a suspect in anything. I walked out to the parking lot and found her standing under a streetlight looking small and broken in the harsh white glow. She had her arms wrapped around herself, even though it wasn't cold. When she saw me, she just stared for a long moment before whispering something I barely heard. "Can I come home, Dad?" The words cracked something open in my chest that I'd been trying to keep sealed shut. I nodded because I couldn't speak, and she walked over to my car. The drive back to my house was completely silent. Lottie curled up in the passenger seat with her knees pulled to her chest, like she used to do when she was little, and we'd drive home late from her mom's hospital appointments. I kept my eyes on the road and my hands tight on the wheel. When we pulled into my driveway, I saw the evidence tape still stretched across my front door, and the porch light illuminating dark stains on the concrete. Lottie started shaking when she saw it. Her whole body just trembled like she was freezing. I unlocked the door, and we stepped over the tape into the entryway, where Kayson's blood had pooled and dried into a dark patch on the floor. I told Lottie she could sleep in her old room and we'd talk in the morning. She nodded without looking at me and disappeared up the stairs. I heard her bedroom door close softly. I went to the living room and sat on the couch with my phone in my hand. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw Lottie's face from that night, 14 months ago. Her dead eyes watching Kayson rob me. No emotion at all. Then I'd see her face from tonight, the terror when Kayson charged into my house, the bruises covering her arms. Which version was real? My mind kept spinning through every possibility like a broken record. Either Lottie had finally escaped an abuser and I'd saved her life tonight, or this was all part of some bigger plan and I'd just shot someone to help her and Kayson pull off whatever they were doing. The bruises looked real, old ones mixed with fresh ones, yellow and green and purple all at the same time. The fear in her eyes when she begged me to let her in looked real too, but I'd been fooled before and the stakes were so much higher now. I'd shot a man. I could go to prison. I sat there all night watching the sky slowly turn gray through my living room window. At 6 a.m. I heard footsteps upstairs. Lottie's bedroom door opened, and she came down the stairs moving slow and careful, like everything hurt. She looked even worse in the daylight coming through the kitchen windows. The black eye was darker. The bruises on her arms stood out sharp against her pale skin. She sat down at the kitchen table in the same chair she used to sit in when she was little, and we'd have breakfast before school. Her mom would make pancakes and Lottie would tell us about her homework. The memory hit me hard. I made coffee with hands that wouldn't stop shaking and sat across from her. I looked at my daughter and said the words I'd been holding back since she showed up on my porch yesterday. Tell me everything, and if you lie to me even once you're out. Lottie started talking, and the story that came out was worse than anything I'd imagined. She admitted the robbery setup was real. Kayson had convinced her I was controlling her and holding her back from her real life. He told her we needed money to start over together somewhere new. She said she believed him because he made her feel special and important in a way she hadn't felt since her mom died. But after that night, everything changed. Kayson got possessive and angry. He didn't want her talking to anyone or going anywhere without him. He started hitting her when she questioned him about anything. She tried to leave twice. The first time he found her at a friend's house and dragged her back and beat her so bad she couldn't walk for 3 days. The second time he broke 2 of her ribs and told her next time he'd kill her. So she stopped trying. I listened to her describe 14 months of getting beaten and controlled, and part of me wanted to believe every single word, but another part kept remembering her dead eyes that night. I asked her straight out if this was another setup. She started crying so hard she could barely breathe. She kept saying she knew I had no reason to trust her, but she was telling the truth. Then without any warning, she pulled up her shirt and showed me her ribs and back. Bruises covered her skin in layers, yellow-green ones that were fading, fresh purple ones. Some looked like finger marks. Others looked like she'd been hit with something. My phone rang at 7 a.m., and I saw it was my sister Marlene. Victor must have told her what happened because she said she was coming over right now. She arrived 10 minutes later and took one look at Lottie sitting at my kitchen table, and her whole expression changed from anger to concern. Marlene pulled me into the hallway and told me those bruises were real and extensive. She said she's a nurse, and she's seen enough domestic violence cases to recognize the patterns. Old injuries at different healing stages. The kind of damage that happens over months, not days. She told me Lottie needed medical records of everything and a safety plan no matter what happened between us in the past. My phone rang again at 9 a.m. Tyler. He said he needed us both back at the station for more questions. Kayson had survived surgery and was in stable condition, but now he was telling a completely different story. He claimed Lottie was a drug addict who stole money from him, and I'd set him up and shot him when he came to get it back. Tyler said they'd found text messages on Kayson's phone that made it look like Lottie had been using pills, and he needed to ask her about that. We drove back to the station and sat in the same interview room. Tyler put his folder on the table and looked at Lottie. She admitted to both of us that she'd started taking pills about 8 months ago. She said Kayson kept giving them to her and telling her they'd help with the pain from the beatings. But then he started controlling when she could have them and used her need for the pills to keep her trapped. Tyler's face stayed neutral, but I could see him thinking about whether this made her story more believable or less. I sat there watching my daughter admit to drug addiction and wondered how I'd missed all of this happening to her. Tyler pulled out Kayson's phone and started swiping through the messages. He turned the screen toward me, and I leaned forward to read. The texts were all over the place, some from Kayson telling Lottie she was worthless and needed him, others where she was begging him for pills and money. I saw one where she called him baby and said she couldn't live without him. My stomach twisted because I couldn't tell if she meant those words or if he'd forced her to write them. Tyler scrolled to another message where Kaysen threatened to hurt her if she didn't do what he said. Then right below it, Lottie was apologizing and saying she loved him. The back and forth pattern made my head spin. Tyler kept scrolling and I saw dozens more just like them. This sick cycle of him tearing her down and her building him back up. Lottie started crying next to me, her shoulders shaking. She grabbed my arm and insisted Kaysen made her send those loving messages. She said he'd take away her pills until she texted him exactly what he wanted to hear. I wanted to believe her, but the words on that screen looked real, looked like she meant them. Tyler watched both of us carefully while I read through more messages. Some were from 2 months ago, others from just last week. In one, Lottie was asking Kaysen for money to buy more pills. In another, she was telling him she'd do anything he wanted if he'd just give her what she needed. I felt sick reading them because my daughter sounded desperate and broken in ways I'd never imagined. Tyler's phone rang and he glanced at the screen before standing up. He told us to wait and stepped out of the interview room. Lottie kept crying quietly beside me, and I didn't know what to say to her. Through the small window in the door, I could see Tyler talking on his phone in the hallway, his expression getting more serious. He was nodding and writing something down in his notebook. When he came back 5 minutes later, his whole posture had changed. He sat down across from us and folded his hands on the table. The prosecutor's office had called him with news about my case. They were thinking about charging me with assault with a deadly weapon because of what I'd said about planning to shoot Kaysen's kneecaps. Tyler explained that my statement made it look like I'd thought about it ahead of time instead of just reacting to danger. He said the fact that I went to get my gun, made a plan in my head, and then opened the door made it harder to claim self-defense. The law required an immediate threat, and I'd technically had time to not open that door and call police instead. My blood went cold listening to him explain this. I'd shot Kaysen to protect Lottie, and now they wanted to charge me with a crime for it. Tyler said they were still deciding what charges to file, but I needed to get a lawyer right away. Lottie grabbed my hand and squeezed it hard, fresh tears running down her face. A public defender named Sam showed up at the station that same afternoon. He was younger than I expected, maybe in his 30s, wearing a wrinkled suit and carrying a beat-up briefcase. We sat in a different room, and he spread papers across the table while explaining my legal situation. The words came at me too fast, and I struggled to follow what he was saying. Sam told me the self-defense claim was complicated because of my own statement. Even though Kaysen had a knife and was charging at me, I'd had options other than opening that door. I could have kept it locked and called police. I could have escaped out the back of my house with Lottie. Instead, I'd retrieved my gun, announced my plan to shoot his kneecaps, and then opened the door knowing he'd probably charge in. Sam said that sequence of events suggested I was looking for a confrontation rather than trying to avoid one. He talked about something called premeditation and how prosecutors would argue I'd planned to shoot Kaysen before I ever opened that door. I tried to explain that I was protecting my daughter, but Sam cut me off gently. He said he understood my motivation, but the law looked at whether I'd had other reasonable options available. He mentioned that prosecutors might offer a plea deal to avoid going to trial. That would mean admitting guilt to a lesser charge in exchange for a lighter sentence. Sam said we'd have to wait and see what they actually decided to charge me with before we could make any decisions. He asked me questions about that morning, writing down everything I said. When he left an hour later, I felt worse than before he'd arrived. The reality that I might go to prison for protecting Lottie was starting to sink in. Marlene took Lottie to the hospital later that day for a full medical examination. I stayed behind because the police said I couldn't be present during the exam. Marlene called me 2 hours later from the hospital parking lot. The doctor had found evidence of repeated trauma over months or even years. Old fractures in Lottie's ribs that had healed wrong. Scar tissue on her back from being hit with something. The 2 cracked ribs we already knew about. Bruises at different stages of healing all over her body. Marlene's voice shook when she told me the doctor said this was consistent with ongoing domestic violence. The medical evidence strongly supported everything Lottie had been saying about Kaysen's abuse. I felt a tiny bit of the crushing doubt start to lift from my chest. Maybe my daughter really had been telling the truth this time. Maybe she really had been trapped and suffering while I refused to believe her. Marlene said the doctor was documenting everything with photographs and detailed notes that could be used as evidence. She told me to meet them back at my house in an hour. That night, Lottie sat across from me at my kitchen table looking small and scared. She asked if she could stay with me while she figured out what to do next. I looked at her bruised face and remembered the texts on Kaysen's phone, and I knew I had to set boundaries this time. I told her yes, but with conditions. She had to get into treatment for her pill addiction immediately. She had to cooperate fully with police and tell them everything about Kaysen. And she had to earn back my trust through actions, not words. I said I loved her, but I couldn't just pretend the past 18 months hadn't happened. Lottie nodded and agreed to everything without arguing. She thanked me with such real emotion in her voice that I wanted to believe her completely. But I was still holding part of myself back, still protecting the part of me that she'd hurt so badly. She went upstairs to her old bedroom, and I heard her crying through the closed door. Over the next few days, a pattern started showing up that made me think Lottie might actually be telling the truth. Kason called her phone constantly from his hospital bed. The first day, he left 6 voicemails. I listened to them with Lottie, and they were awful. In some, he was telling her he loved her and needed her and couldn't live without her. In others, he was threatening to kill her when he got out. Back and forth between sweet talk and violence. When police told him to stop calling, his friends started calling instead with messages from him. The texts and voicemails kept coming, and they all had the same pattern. Tyler came by the house on day 2 to listen to some of them, and he said it was classic abuser behavior. He explained that abusers panic when they lose control over their victim, and they alternate between love bombing and threats to try to get that control back. Watching this pattern play out in real time made me see that Lottie had been living with this manipulation for months. The messages were possessive and controlling in ways that made my skin crawl. Kason acted like he owned her and couldn't accept that she'd gotten away from him. On day 3, Lottie started showing withdrawal symptoms. I came downstairs in the morning and found her on the couch sweating even though the house was cool. Her hands were shaking and she looked pale. By afternoon, she was throwing up and could barely stand. Marlene came over and confirmed what I already suspected. Lottie was going through withdrawal from the pills. Marlene made some calls and found a detox program that had an opening. Watching my daughter go through withdrawal over the next 2 days was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. She was sick and shaking and crying. Between bouts of throwing up, she kept apologizing for everything she'd put me through. I sat with her during the worst of it, because despite everything that had happened, she was still my daughter, and I couldn't abandon her when she was suffering like this. Marlene stayed with us most of the time, checking Lottie's vital signs and making sure she stayed hydrated. By the end of day 2, Lottie was weak, but the worst seemed to be over. The prosecutor filed formal charges against me on day 5. Sam called to tell me I was charged with assault with a deadly weapon with a sentencing enhancement for use of a firearm. He explained in his calm lawyer voice that I was looking at potential prison time if convicted. He thought we had a strong defense given the circumstances, but trials were unpredictable. My first court appearance was scheduled for 2 weeks out. When I hung up the phone, the reality hit me like a physical blow. I might actually go to prison for protecting my daughter. I might lose my house, my freedom, everything, because I'd made the choice to let Lottie in that morning and defend her from Kason. Sam had said the sentencing enhancement added years to the potential sentence. I sat at my kitchen table staring at nothing and trying to process what my life had become. Victor gave a statement to police that same week, confirming what he'd seen that morning. He told them he'd watched Kason's truck pull up to my curb and saw Kason get out and charge toward my house in an aggressive way. Several other neighbors reported hearing Kason's threats and seeing his truck parked outside my house multiple times over the previous day. The prosecution's theory that I'd ambushed Kason was starting to look weaker with all this witness testimony. But Sam warned me on the phone that my premeditation statement was still a major problem we needed to overcome. The fact that I'd said out loud that I planned to shoot Kason's kneecaps before opening the door was going to be hard to explain away. Sam said prosecutors would hammer that point and try to prove I'd been looking for an excuse to shoot Kason rather than genuinely defending myself and Lottie. Lottie completed detox after a week, and Marlene helped arrange for her to move into a transitional living facility for women escaping domestic violence. The facility had rules and structure and counseling services. Lottie wasn't allowed to have unsupervised visits with me because of my pending criminal charges, but we could talk on the phone every day. I called her that first night after she moved in, and she sounded clearer and more like herself than she had in months. Her voice wasn't slurred or confused anymore. She told me about her room and her roommate and the schedule they had to follow. She said she wanted to testify on my behalf about what Kason was really like and how he'd been threatening her. I told her to focus on her own recovery first and not worry about my case. But hearing her sound so much better gave me hope that maybe she really was going to make it this time. 2 days later, Tyler called with news that made my chest feel lighter for the first time in weeks. Kason had been released from the hospital that morning after his knee surgery. The moment he was wheeled out of the recovery room, 2 uniformed officers arrested him on the outstanding warrant from the robbery 14 months ago. Tyler said they took him straight to county jail for booking. He told me the district attorney was building additional cases against Kason based on everything they found on his phone. Text messages showed he was selling pills to at least a dozen people. Messages to Lottie proved a pattern of threats and control that supported domestic violence charges. Tyler said the evidence was strong enough that Kason would likely face years in prison even without my case factoring in. Knowing Kaysen was locked up behind bars made me sleep through the night for the first time since the shooting. I still woke up at 3 a.m. out of habit, but instead of staring at the ceiling worrying, I rolled over and went back to sleep. My own legal problems were far from over, but at least Kaysen couldn't hurt Lottie anymore while he sat in a cell. 3 weeks after the shooting, my phone buzzed with a text from Lottie asking if I would meet her at a coffee shop downtown. She said Marlene would come too if that made me more comfortable. I stared at the message for a long time before typing back, yes. The coffee shop was neutral ground, public, safe. I got there early and sat in a corner booth where I could see the door. Marlene arrived first and slid into the seat across from me. She squeezed my hand and told me Lottie was doing really well in her program. When Lottie walked in 10 minutes later, I barely recognized her. She looked healthier than I'd seen her in over a year. Her skin had color again instead of that gray pallor. Her eyes were clear and focused. She'd gained back some weight, and her clothes fit properly instead of hanging off her frame. She sat down next to Marlene and folded her hands on the table in front of her. Her fingers were shaking slightly. She told me she'd been clean for 16 days, and it was the longest she'd gone without using in 8 months. She said her counselor had her in therapy 3 times a week, working through everything that happened. She was learning about manipulation and abuse patterns and addiction cycles. Her voice was steady when she talked, not slurred or scattered like before. She said she wanted to make real amends for the robbery and for all the pain she caused me. She pulled an envelope from her purse and slid it across the table. She said her therapist helped her write a letter, and she wanted me to read it when I was ready. I picked up the envelope and turned it over in my hands. The paper was slightly wrinkled like it had been folded and unfolded many times. I opened it right there at the table and started reading. Lottie's handwriting filled 3 pages front and back. The letter was raw and honest in a way that made my throat tight. She wrote about meeting Kaysen and how he slowly isolated her from everyone who cared about her. She wrote about the jewelry box night and how drunk and high she was, how Kaysen convinced her I was the enemy keeping her from being happy. But then she wrote something that hit me hard. She said even though Kaysen manipulated her, she still chose to go along with the robbery setup. She wrote that she looked into my eyes that night while he held a knife to my neck, and she chose to do nothing. She said she couldn't blame everything on Kaysen because she had made choices too. She wrote that she betrayed her own father for drug money, and there was no excuse for that. She didn't try to make herself sound like a victim in the letter. She took full ownership of what she did. The last paragraph said she didn't expect me to forgive her, and she wouldn't blame me if I never wanted to see her again. But she wanted me to know she was working every single day to become someone I could be proud of again someday. She signed it, "Your daughter Lottie," and seeing those words made my eyes burn. I folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope. I looked at Lottie across the table and told her thank you for being honest. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. That was all I could manage to say without breaking down completely. Over the next few weeks, my court date got closer, and Sam worked on building our defense strategy. He came to my house twice a week to go over everything. He said our best argument was that Kaysen posed an immediate threat based on his history of violence and the fact that he charged in with a knife raised. Sam wanted to use Lottie's testimony about the abuse she suffered and Kaysen's controlling behavior. He said if the jury understood what kind of person Kaysen was, they might see why I felt I had no choice but to protect my daughter. I asked if Lottie was willing to testify, and Sam said she'd already agreed, but he warned me the prosecution would try to destroy her on the stand. They would bring up her drug use and her involvement in the robbery setup. They would try to make her look like a liar who couldn't be trusted. Sam said we had to prepare for the trial to go either way. Juries were unpredictable, and my statement about planning to shoot kneecaps was still a major problem we couldn't fix. I signed papers authorizing Sam to subpoena medical records and police reports. I gave him a list of character witnesses, including Victor and Marlene. We prepared for trial, knowing I might end up in prison despite everything. The week before trial was supposed to start, Sam called me early in the morning. His voice sounded different, more energetic. He said the prosecution wanted to offer a plea deal. Instead of assault with a deadly weapon, they would let me plead guilty to reckless endangerment. It was a misdemeanor instead of a felony. The sentence would be 2 years probation, community service, and anger management classes. No jail time, no felony conviction destroying my record forever. Sam said I should seriously consider taking it because trials were unpredictable. If the jury convicted me of the original charge, I could face 3 to 5 years in prison. The sentencing enhancement for using a firearm added even more time. But taking the plea meant admitting I was wrong to protect Lottie. It meant saying I should have kept the door closed and called the police instead. I sat at my kitchen table staring at the wall trying to decide. Sam reminded me that I did technically have other options that morning. I could have not opened the door. I could have called 911 and waited for police. The fact that I chose to confront Kaysen with a loaded gun was a choice I made. Sam said the law didn't care that I was trying to protect my daughter. The law cared that I created a deadly situation when I had alternatives. I asked Sam what he would do if it was his daughter, and he got quiet for a long time. Then he said he would probably take the plea because prison wouldn't help anyone. I called Sam back the next day and told him I would accept the deal. A week later, I stood in front of a judge and formally pleaded guilty to reckless endangerment. The courtroom was mostly empty, except for Marlene sitting in the back row and the court staff. The prosecutor read the charges and asked if I understood what I was pleading guilty to. I said yes, even though my voice came out rough. The judge asked if anyone forced me to take this plea, and I said no. Then he sentenced me right there. 2 years probation with regular check-ins with a probation officer, 100 hours of community service to be completed within the first year, mandatory anger management classes every week for 6 months. The judge said if I violated any terms of my probation, I would go to prison to serve out the original sentence. I thanked the judge and walked out of the courtroom with a criminal record. It felt strange to be convicted of a crime for protecting Lottie, but I was grateful to avoid prison time and keep a felony off my record. Marlene hugged me in the hallway outside and told me it was the right choice. I wanted to believe her. 2 weeks after my sentencing, Tyler called to tell me about Kayson's case. Kayson had taken a plea deal too, rather than go to trial. He pleaded guilty to the robbery charges from 14 months ago and received 3 years in state prison. The domestic violence charges were harder to make stick because Lottie's testimony couldn't be used in that case due to some legal rule about witness credibility. But the drug distribution charges were solid based on all the evidence from his phone. Those charges added another 18 months to his sentence. Tyler said with good behavior, Kayson would likely serve at least 4 years total before being eligible for parole. Knowing he would be locked up that long gave me the first real peace I'd felt since this whole thing started. 4 years meant Lottie would have time to get strong and build a new life before Kayson got out. 4 years meant I could sleep without worrying he would come after us. I thanked Tyler for everything he did, and he told me to take care of my daughter. Lottie kept going to her recovery program every day, and after about 6 weeks, she started working part-time at a coffee shop near her housing facility. She sent me a picture of her first paycheck, and the pride in her text message was obvious. She wrote that it felt amazing to earn money honestly, instead of stealing or manipulating. She said her manager told her she was a hard worker and might get more hours soon. Marlene suggested we start having weekly dinners at her house, so Lottie and I could spend time together in a neutral space. The first dinner was awkward with long silences and careful conversation. But by the 3rd week, we started to relax a little. Lottie would tell stories about customers at the coffee shop, and I would update her on my probation requirements. Marlene kept the conversation moving when things got tense. Slowly, we were rebuilding something between us. It didn't look like our old relationship, and it never would, but it was real and honest in a way we'd never had before. During one dinner about 2 months after the shooting, Lottie brought up her recovery program steps. She said one of the steps involved making amends to people she hurt. She looked directly at me and said she wanted to pay me back for the money Kayson stole during the robbery. She knew it would take years on her coffee shop salary, but she wanted to do it anyway. She said it was important to her to make things right through actions instead of just words. I told her I didn't need the money back and she should focus on building her own savings. But Lottie shook her head and said this wasn't about what I needed. It was about what she needed to do to prove she was changing. We agreed she would make monthly payments of whatever she could afford as a symbol of her commitment. The amount didn't matter as much as the consistency of following through. She pulled out her phone right there and set up a reminder to transfer money to me on the 1st of every month. Seeing her take that kind of ownership made something in my chest loosen slightly. After Lottie left that night, Marlene asked me to stay for a few minutes. She poured us both coffee and sat down across from me at her kitchen table. She told me she was proud of how I was handling everything with Lottie. She said it would be easy to either completely shut Lottie out forever or let her back in without any boundaries. But I was doing the hard work of maintaining both love and accountability at the same time. She said Lottie needed to know I loved her, but also that actions had consequences. Marlene's words meant more than she probably knew because I'd been questioning every single decision I made regarding Lottie. Part of me worried I was being too hard on her. Another part worried I was being too soft and setting myself up to be hurt again. Marlene said there was no perfect way to handle this situation. All I could do was keep showing up and being honest about my boundaries. She reminded me that Lottie was doing the work, and that was what mattered most. I drove home that night feeling like maybe we really could build something new from all this wreckage. 3 months after the shooting, my phone rang at 9 p.m., unknown number. I answered carefully and heard Lottie crying on the other end. She told me she just hit 90 days clean, and her voice was shaking with emotion. She asked if I would come to her celebration at the recovery center tomorrow night. I said yes, without hesitating. Marlene drove with me to the center the next evening. We walked into a room full of folding chairs, and about 30 people sitting in a circle. Lottie was near the front wearing jeans and a plain blue shirt. She saw me, and her face lit up. The meeting started and several people shared their stories. Then Lottie's sponsor called her up to receive her 90-day chip. Lottie stood and walked to the front. She held the small coin in her hand and started talking about her journey. She said she hurt people who loved her and made choices she was ashamed of. She looked directly at me and said her father gave her another chance when she didn't deserve one. She thanked her sponsor and her therapist and everyone who supported her. She said she was grateful to be alive and sober. People clapped, and I felt something shift in my chest. Not full trust yet, but something close to hope. After the meeting, Lottie hugged me tight and whispered, "Thank you." I drove home that night thinking maybe she really was changing this time. 2 weeks later, Lottie called me panicking. She said someone from Kayson's old crew visited him in prison and brought back messages for her. The messages said she belonged to him and he would find her when he got out. She was shaking when she told me. I felt rage flood through me again, but I forced myself to stay calm. I told her to report it immediately to her program director. She did, and they helped her document everything. Tyler got involved and said the threats were parole violations that could add time to Kayson's sentence. I met Lottie at the courthouse 3 days later to file for a restraining order. We sat in the waiting area for 2 hours filling out forms. The paperwork asked for details about Kayson's abuse and threats. Lottie's hand shook as she wrote. I put my hand on her shoulder and told her she was safe now. The judge approved the restraining order for 5 years, extending past Kayson's release date. Walking out of the courthouse, Lottie looked relieved, but still scared. I promised her I would help keep her safe, and this time I meant it without the blind trust I had before. My anger management classes met every Tuesday night in a community center basement. I went expecting basic breathing exercises and useless advice, but the counselor was different from I expected. She was older with gray hair and she didn't mess around. She made us talk about what was really driving our anger. During week 4, she asked me about my wife. I told her she died of cancer 3 years ago. The counselor asked how that connected to shooting Kayson. I said it didn't connect at all. She looked at me hard and said grief and guilt often show up as rage. She asked if I felt guilty about my wife's death. I said no, because cancer wasn't my fault. She asked if I felt like I failed to protect her. That question hit me like a punch. I realized I had been carrying guilt about not saving my wife from cancer. That guilt made me overprotective of Lottie and rageful when she got hurt. The counselor said, understanding the pattern didn't excuse shooting someone, but it helped me make better choices going forward. I drove home that night feeling like someone had opened a window in a room that had been closed for years. The following Sunday, Lottie called and asked if we could visit her mother's grave together. We hadn't gone together since before she met Kayson. I picked her up at 10 a.m. and we drove to the cemetery in silence. The grave was under an oak tree in the back section. We stood there looking at the headstone with my wife's name carved into granite. Lottie started crying immediately. She dropped to her knees in the grass and said she was sorry. She apologized to her mother for the person she became and promised to do better. She said she was ashamed of what she did and wished her mother was here to guide her. I knelt down next to her and put my arm around her shoulders. We both cried together for the first time since my wife died. I realized we had been grieving separately all this time, letting the loss divide us instead of bring us together. Lottie leaned against me and I held her while she sobbed. After a while, we both got quiet and just sat there in the grass. The sun was warm and the cemetery was peaceful. I felt closer to Lottie in that moment than I had in years. Lottie wiped her eyes and started talking about the jewelry box incident. She said she remembered Kayson holding her mother's ring and saying, "Dead people don't need jewelry." She said she was so drunk and high that night she didn't fully process how awful those words were. She said she's been carrying shame about it ever since, and working through it in therapy. She asked if she could have one piece of her mother's jewelry, not to keep forever, but to wear as a reminder of who she wanted to be. I thought about it for a minute. Then I reached into my pocket and pulled out the simple gold necklace my wife wore every single day. I had been carrying it with me since the shooting, not really knowing why. I handed it to Lottie and told her it was hers now. She held it carefully like it might break and started crying again. She put it on right there at the grave and touched it with her fingers. She said she would wear it every day and remember to be better. We stayed at the grave for another hour, just sitting together in silence. When we finally left, something felt different between us. Lighter somehow. 6 months after the shooting, Lottie moved out of transitional housing. She found a shared apartment with another woman from her recovery program. She was working full-time at a restaurant downtown and taking online classes to finish her degree. She called and invited me to see her new place. I drove over on a Saturday afternoon. The apartment was small but clean with 2 bedrooms and a shared living space. Lottie's room had a bed, a desk, and a small bookshelf. Everything was organized and simple. No chaos or drama or signs of the mess her life used to be. She showed me around proudly, pointing out the kitchen where she cooked healthy meals and the corner where she did her homework. Her roommate was at work, but Lottie said they got along well and supported each other's recovery. I looked around and felt surprised by how normal everything seemed. This was just a regular young woman building a regular life. No crisis or emergency or disaster waiting to happen. Just someone working hard and making good choices one day at a time. While I was there, Lottie pulled out a journal from her desk drawer. She said her therapist had her keeping track of her triggers and coping strategies. She opened it and showed me pages filled with her handwriting. Some pages listed situations that made her want to use drugs. Other pages listed healthy ways to deal with stress. She had been writing about our relationship too, and working through her feelings about the robbery and everything that happened after. She said it helped her process things, instead of just pushing them down. Then she looked at me and asked if I would be willing to do a joint therapy session with her. She said her therapist thought it might help us work on our communication. I felt nervous about the idea of sitting in a room talking about our problems with a stranger. But I looked at Lottie's hopeful face and said yes. She smiled and hugged me. She said it meant a lot that I was willing to try. I left her apartment that day feeling like maybe we really could build something new between us. The joint therapy session happened 2 weeks later. I sat on a couch in the therapist's office with Lottie next to me. The therapist was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes. She started by asking us both to talk about the robbery and how it affected our relationship. I went first and tried to explain the betrayal and the loss of trust. I started crying while talking about how Lottie just watched while Kaysen held a knife to my neck. Lottie cried too and said she understood if I never fully trusted her again. She said she didn't trust herself back then either. The therapist let us both cry for a while. Then she asked me what I needed from Lottie going forward. I said I needed consistent actions over time, not just words. I said I needed her to prove through her choices that she was different now. Lottie nodded and said that was fair. The therapist asked Lottie what she needed from me. Lottie said she needed to know I still loved her, even though she hurt me. I told her I never stopped loving her even when I couldn't trust her. The therapist helped us understand that our relationship would never be what it was before, but we could build something new based on honesty and consistent action over time. She said trust had to be earned back slowly, through repeated proof, not through one big gesture. We both agreed to keep working on it. Walking out of that session, I felt exhausted, but also relieved. We had said hard things out loud and survived it. 1 year after the shooting, Lottie reached her 1-year sobriety milestone. She invited me to the celebration, and I brought Marlene with me. When we arrived at the recovery center, the room was packed with people. Lottie had made friends in the program, and they all showed up to support her. She stood at the front and received her 1-year chip. Then she gave a speech about her journey. She talked about hitting rock bottom and hurting people she loved. She said her father gave her a second chance when she didn't deserve one, and she was grateful every single day. She thanked her sponsor and her therapist and everyone in the room. She said recovery gave her back her life and her family. She looked at me while she talked, and I felt tears streaming down my face. I tried to stay composed, but I couldn't. Marlene handed me a tissue, but it didn't help. I had to step outside because I was crying too hard to stay in the room. Marlene followed me out and put her arm around me. She said these were good tears, and I should let them come. I stood in the parking lot sobbing while inside Lottie finished her speech. When she came out to find me, I hugged her tight and told her I was proud of her. She cried too, and we stood there holding each other in the parking lot. 2 weeks later, I had my regular meeting with my probation officer. He reviewed my file and said I was doing well with all my requirements. I had completed my community service hours and attended all my anger management classes. He said if I completed the full 2 years without any violations, the conviction might be eligible for expungement. That meant my record could eventually be cleared like the shooting never happened legally. I felt something heavy lift off my chest hearing those words. I thanked him and left his office feeling lighter than I had in months. That night at dinner with Lottie, I told her about the expungement possibility. She started crying immediately and said she had been carrying guilt about my criminal record. She said knowing it might be cleared someday made her feel less terrible about what her choices cost me. I told her to focus on her own recovery and not worry about my record, but I could see the relief on her face. We finished dinner and she walked me to my car. She hugged me goodbye and said she loved me. I said it back and meant it completely. 3 weeks later, Tyler called me about Kaysen's parole hearing. The parole board scheduled it for the following month, and both Lottie and I needed to submit victim impact statements. Tyler came to my house with the paperwork and helped us understand what to write. He said we should focus on specific examples of violence and manipulation, not just general statements about fear. Lottie sat at my kitchen table with her hands shaking as she wrote about the beatings and the control and the pills. She detailed how Kaysen isolated her from everyone and threatened her when she tried to leave. I wrote about the robbery setup and the knife at my neck and how my daughter had been turned into someone I didn't recognize. Tyler reviewed both statements and said they were strong and specific. The hearing happened on a Tuesday morning and neither of us attended in person. Tyler called me that afternoon with the news. The parole board denied Kayson's request, and he would serve his full sentence. I immediately called Lottie and heard her start crying with relief. She said she could finally stop looking over her shoulder constantly. That night, I slept better than I had in months, knowing he would stay locked up. 2 months after the parole hearing, my phone rang while I was making dinner. Lottie's name showed on the screen, and I answered to hear her talking fast and excited. She got promoted to shift supervisor at the restaurant. Her manager had been watching her take on more responsibility and wrote her a review that praised her reliability and leadership. I could hear genuine pride in her voice as she told me about the pay raise and the new schedule. Marlene invited us both to her house for dinner to celebrate, and Lottie showed up with a bottle of sparkling cider. Over pasta and salad, Lottie talked about how much she enjoyed restaurant work. She said the fast pace kept her focused, and the structure helped her stay clean. Then she mentioned maybe going to culinary school eventually. Marlene and I exchanged a look across the table. This was the first time Lottie had talked about future plans with real excitement instead of vague promises. A week after that celebration, Lottie called and asked if she could come to my house for dinner. The question made me pause because we hadn't been back there together since the shooting. The entryway had been cleaned and repaired months ago, but we both knew the memories lived there. I told her yes, and she arrived on Saturday evening carrying flowers. She stood on the porch for a moment before coming inside, and I saw her glance at the spot where Kayson had fallen. We didn't talk about it. Instead, she followed me to the kitchen and helped me chop vegetables for stir-fry. We moved around each other carefully, finding a rhythm that felt almost normal. She told me about difficult customers at work, and I told her about a project I was doing in the garage. We ate at the dining room table and she complimented the food and asked for seconds. After dinner, we watched a movie on the couch, and she fell asleep halfway through. I covered her with a blanket and let her rest. When she woke up an hour later, she apologized for dozing off. I told her it was fine and that she was welcome anytime. She hugged me goodbye at the door and said this felt like a glimpse of what our relationship could become. During that same dinner, while we were still eating, Lottie set down her fork and told me she had been dating someone. She met him through a friend from work about a month ago. She said his name was Jesse, and he worked as an electrician. She was being very careful to take things slowly and watch for red flags. She listed the things she was paying attention to, like how he treated servers at restaurants and whether he respected her boundaries. Then she asked if I would like to meet him eventually. The question surprised me more than I expected. She was asking for my approval and input, treating me like a father again instead of someone she had to hide things from. I told her I would like that when she was ready. She smiled and said maybe in a few weeks, once she felt more sure about him. 18 months after the shooting, Lottie brought Jesse to meet me and Marlene. We met at a casual restaurant for lunch on a Sunday. Jesse was a quiet guy in his early 30s with work-worn hands and a careful way of speaking. I watched how he treated Lottie throughout the meal. He asked her opinion before ordering appetizers. He listened when she talked without interrupting. When she excused herself to use the bathroom, he didn't check her phone or act possessive. Marlene asked him about his work, and he answered directly without bragging or deflecting. After lunch, we walked to a nearby park, and I observed how he stayed next to Lottie without crowding her space. When we said goodbye, he shook my hand and thanked me for meeting him. After they drove away, Marlene turned to me and said, Lottie seemed genuinely happy and healthy. I realized she was right. My daughter had done the hard work of recovery, and it showed in everything from her posture to her smile. A month later, I met with my probation officer for what turned out to be my final regular check-in. He reviewed my file and noted I had completed all my community service hours early and attended every anger management class. He said my record showed consistent compliance with 0 violations. Then he told me he was recommending early completion of my probation. My lawyer started the expungement process immediately. The final hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks out. When the date arrived, I sat in the courthouse waiting room with my lawyer beside me. The judge called my case and reviewed the documents. She noted my clean record prior to the incident and my completion of all requirements. She granted the expungement. Walking out of the courthouse, I felt like I could finally breathe fully for the first time in 2 years. The weight of that conviction had been pressing on my chest constantly, and now it was gone. I called Lottie from the parking lot and she started crying. She said she had been carrying guilt about my criminal record, and knowing it was cleared made her feel less terrible about what her choices cost me. 6 months after that, Lottie reached 2 years of sobriety. This celebration was bigger than the 1-year milestone. Her sponsor arranged for a private room at the recovery center and invited everyone important in Lottie's journey. I arrived with Marlene to find the room already filling with people. Lottie's therapist was there along with her boyfriend Jesse and several friends from her program. The director of the center gave opening remarks about the significance of 2 years. Then Lottie stood at the front to receive her chip and give her speech. She talked about how recovery gave her back her family and her self-respect. She said the first year was about staying clean, and the second year was about building a life worth protecting. When she talked about the people who refused to give up on her, she looked directly at me. I mouthed the words "I love you" across the room and saw her smile through tears. After the ceremony, people congratulated her and shared their own stories. I stood to the side watching my daughter connect with her community and felt grateful she had found these people. 3 months later, on what would have been my wife's birthday, Lottie and I visited the grave together again. The last time we came here together, the grief had felt sharp and raw. This time felt different. We brought flowers and stood in the quiet cemetery mourning. Lottie told her mother about her sobriety and her job and her boyfriend Jesse. She said she was proud of the person she was becoming and hoped her mother would be too. I added that I was proud of the woman Lottie was becoming and that her mother would have been amazed by her strength. We stood there for a long time just being present with the memory. When we walked back to the car, I put my arm around Lottie's shoulders and she leaned into me. I realized the grief was still there, but it felt softer now, less like an open wound and more like an old scar that had finally healed properly. 2 weeks after that grave visit, Tyler called with news that made my stomach drop. Kason had been released from prison after serving his full sentence. Within 24 hours of his release, he violated the restraining order by trying to contact Lottie through social media. She saw the friend request and the message immediately and reported it without opening the message. Tyler said they arrested Kason for the violation and he received additional jail time. Tyler told me Kason's pattern of behavior meant he would likely keep violating and end up back in prison repeatedly. While that was sad in its own way, it kept Lottie safe. I asked Tyler what would happen if Kason kept this up, and Tyler said eventually the violations would stack up to serious prison time. For now, Lottie had another 6 months of safety, while Kason sat in county jail for the restraining order violation. A month after Kason's arrest for the violation, Lottie enrolled in culinary school part-time while continuing to work at the restaurant. She called me after her first day of classes sounding energized and focused. The structured environment suited her, and she liked having clear goals to work toward. She showed me her first assignment the following weekend, a meal plan she had designed for a hypothetical client. She had researched nutrition and portion sizes and created detailed shopping lists. She talked excitedly about eventually opening her own small cafe, maybe something focused on healthy comfort food. Listening to her talk about the future with hope and concrete plans, I saw the daughter I thought I had lost forever. She was building something real through consistent effort and honest work. I told her I believed in her vision and would support her however I could. She smiled and said, having my support meant everything to her recovery. A few weeks later, Lottie invited me to Thanksgiving dinner at her apartment. She was hosting for the first time and cooking everything herself. I arrived with Marlene and met Lottie's boyfriend Jesse at the door, along with 3 friends from her recovery program. The apartment smelled like roasted turkey and fresh bread. Lottie moved around her small kitchen with confidence, checking temperatures and stirring pots like she had been doing this for years. She wore an apron that said, "Kiss the cook," and her face was flushed from the heat, but she was smiling. We sat around her dining table that she had borrowed extra chairs for, and the food was really good. The turkey was moist, the stuffing had the right amount of seasoning, and her homemade rolls were better than anything I had tasted in years. After we finished eating, Lottie stood up and tapped her glass with a fork. She thanked everyone for coming and said this group of people were her chosen family. She said they had all helped her build a life worth living, and she was grateful for every single person at the table. I saw tears in her eyes, but they were happy tears. Marlene reached over and squeezed my hand. The following Sunday, Lottie and I met for breakfast at a diner near her apartment. We sat in a booth by the window and ordered coffee and eggs. We talked about her week at work and my week at home and nothing important really, just normal conversation. It felt good to sit across from her and not have tension between us. The next Sunday we did it again, and then the Sunday after that. It became our thing, this weekly breakfast, where we just existed together without drama or crisis. One morning, about 2 months in, Lottie told me these Sunday breakfasts were her favorite part of the week. She said having this regular time with me helped her feel grounded and connected. I realized they had become my favorite part of the week, too. These simple meals in a boring diner meant more to me than fancy dinners or special occasions ever had. We were rebuilding something real through just showing up consistently for each other. 3 years after the morning I shot Kason, an envelope arrived in my mailbox with Lottie's handwriting on it. Inside was a letter she had written by hand on nice paper. She wrote that she had been thinking about how far we had both come since that terrible morning. She said she put us both through hell, and she knew that. She acknowledged that my decision to let her in that morning saved her life, even though it cost me so much. She wrote that she had spent 3 years trying to become someone worthy of that sacrifice. She said she hoped I could see that she was different now, that she had changed in real and lasting ways. She talked about the therapy and the recovery work and the daily choices she made to be better. She ended by saying she understood if I never fully trusted her again, but she wanted me to know she was committed to proving herself for as long as it took. I read the letter 3 times sitting at my kitchen table. Then I got out paper and a pen and wrote my own letter back to her. I told her that I did see the changes, and I was proud of the work she had done. I was honest that I would probably always carry some fear of being betrayed again. The memory of that knife against my neck and her dead eyes watching would never completely fade. But I was choosing to trust her anyway because love requires that leap of faith. I wrote that our relationship was not what it was before, and it never would be. Too much had happened for us to go back to that innocent father-daughter bond we had when she was young. But in some ways, what we had now was stronger because it was built on truth instead of assumptions. I told her I loved her and I believed in her future. I mailed the letter the next day. 2 months later, I sat in an auditorium watching Lottie walk across a stage in a cap and gown. She was graduating from culinary school with honors. Marlene sat next to me, and Jessie was on my other side. When they called Lottie's name, she walked up with her head high and accepted her diploma. The director shook her hand and said something that made Lottie smile. I thought about that morning 3.5 years ago when she showed up on my porch bruised and barefoot. I thought about how broken she had been and how far she had come through sheer determination. She had built a completely new life through daily choice and hard work. After the ceremony, we took photos outside, and Lottie introduced me to her instructors. One of them told me Lottie was one of the most dedicated students she had ever taught. I felt proud in a way that was different from the easy pride of her childhood accomplishments. This pride was earned through witnessing real transformation. A week after graduation, my phone rang while I was watching TV. It was Lottie calling from the restaurant where she had just finished her first shift as a sous chef at a respected downtown restaurant. She sounded exhausted but excited. She told me the head chef had said she had real talent and she was exactly what they needed in the kitchen. I could hear the confidence in her voice. It was not the fake confidence of someone pretending or the desperate confidence of someone trying to convince themselves. It was the real confidence that comes from earned success and genuine praise. She described the kitchen and the other cooks and the dishes they were preparing. She talked fast, like she could not contain her excitement. I listened and smiled and told her I was proud of her. She said she had to go, but she would call me tomorrow. For my birthday that year, Lottie asked if she could cook dinner for me at my house. She showed up in the afternoon with bags of groceries and took over my kitchen. She made a fancy meal using techniques she learned in culinary school. There was seared duck breast with a cherry sauce and roasted vegetables and potatoes cooked in duck fat. Everything was plated beautifully like something from a restaurant. We ate in the dining room where we used to have family meals when her mother was alive. The ghosts in that room felt friendly now instead of painful. After dinner, Lottie gave me a wrapped present. Inside was a framed photo of the 3 of us from before everything fell apart. Me and Lottie and her mother at the beach, all of us smiling. Lottie told me she was grateful I never stopped being her father, even when she stopped being a good daughter. I hugged her and told her I loved her. We cleaned up the kitchen together, washing dishes and putting away leftovers. Lottie was quiet for a while, and then she said she had been making her monthly payments to me for 3 years now. She asked if we could consider the debt paid. I dried my hands on a towel and looked at her. I told her the debt was paid long ago through her actions and her commitment to change. The money was never really the point. She hugged me tight and whispered, "Thank you." Standing there in my kitchen with my daughter in my arms, I realized we had both finally forgiven ourselves for the choices we made that terrible morning. Our relationship would always carry the scars of what happened. I would always remember the knife and the robbery and the fear. She would always carry the shame of what she did, but we had built something real and lasting from the ruins. We had found our way back to each other through honesty and time and consistent effort. It was not the relationship we had before, but it was enough. That's how it went down for me. What do you think? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I always end up learning something new from you.